welcome all. We are very glad you came. For me, it is very nice to be out of the ground since I have rested in this place since 1876. My name is Cyril S. Hicks. I was born in the town of Chile in New York State. I was born in 1936. 1936 and 1937 were tumultuous years in the United States. There was a national financial crisis, had to do with the value of paper money. As I stated, I was born in 1936 in the town of Chile, New York, C-H-I-L-I. It was a town of about 250 people. It was a year of major tumult in the United States, a major financial crisis having to do with the value of paper money. There was a major event in the United States. The Erie Canal opened, facilitating immigration from east to west. Michigan was trying desperately for statehood, and Michigan was, in all aspects, in a state of war with Ohio over boundaries in the year that my family, my mom, my dad, my brother Roland, and I moved to Richmond Township. We moved to a farm, 80 acres, and I worked. I worked on the family farm, and I hired out. When hired out and working on the family farm, I plowed, I harvested, I milked, I pulled weeds, I churned, I cut timber, I cut firewood for the school, probably in lieu of tuition. I loaded wagons with gravel that were used for road maintenance, and that was probably in lieu of taxes. I floated logs to sawmills. I split logs. I split a lot of logs. The reason that I split a lot of logs was barbed wire was patented and went into production 2 years after I returned from the Civil War. So confining livestock, protecting gardens was done with split rail fences. I enjoyed the relationship between the president that I deeply admired and our mutual splitting rails. In September of 1861, I walked to Romeo. This was after I had advanced my education and advanced my social skills. I went to singing school after grade school. I raised money for a singing school. I went to debate school after my 8th grade education, and I actually debated. I went to spelling school after my 8th grade education. I read novels, I read newspapers, I actually read Lincoln's inaugural address. After enlisting, I was given the rank of corporal. As a corporal, my first assignment was recruiting. I was reasonably successful as a recruiter. I did it throughout my military career, went home on furlough. I was a diarist. I entered almost daily entries into my diary. I was a correspondent. I wrote a lot of letters. And during the war, if I had 3 days in succession when I did not receive inbound mail, depression was a feature of my attitude. My unit, the Michigan 9th, was an unusual unit. Today we would be classified as a quartermaster unit. We inventoried the supplies that were available to us. We ordered supplies that we needed, and we distributed supplies to those who needed them. It's important to recognize we were at the end of the supply chain. The next units downstream from us were combat units. The other task my unit was assigned was guarding headquarters operations. The senior staff, incidentally mostly political appointees, did not want to be within cannon range of the major battles. So they selected the sites for advanced command posts. We were charged with guarding those command posts. Often the selection of the sites for command posts were satisfactory for the command, but extremely difficult for those of us who guarded them. The sites were often muddy, the sites were often exposed, and the sites selected were often at long distance from available water. Guarding those sites, particularly at night, in a hostile environment, we were an occupation army, was extremely difficult. No artificial light. The enemy knew the territory, and we often did not. Our supply chain was of a major concern. We were often short. Ammunition, bedding, getting blankets was extremely difficult. Getting climate-appropriate clothing was extremely difficult. And because of the difficulty in guarding these sites, especially commanded by officers who often had no military training whatsoever, my unit was involved in a vicious firefight with a Confederate group. We were approximately 200 able-bodied. Sickness had decimated our manpower, and our unit was not reinforced, and our unit was actually split. So 200 or so of us faced a Confederate cavalry of 2,500. We were surrounded and we surrendered. I was in Confederate custody for only 3 days, from July 12th to July 15th. We were then paroled. We were moved north with Confederate prisoners. The terms of our parole meant we had no ability at all to engage in any war-related activity. We could not draw pay. We could not draw food. We could not draw clothing. And our senior officers ordered us to guard the Confederate troops, an act of war. Our junior officers forbade us to do it, so there was talk of mutiny, there was talk of desertion, there was talk of failing to follow articles of war. It got straightened out and we returned to active duty. Death was a constant companion of mine during the war. Very personally, I visited my brother, who was in another unit, but in our hospital. I was told on the day I visited him he was likely to recover. I came back the next day, he was deceased. I personally arranged to have his body embalmed, personally arranged rail transportation for him to be buried here in Richmond. But death from combat casualties, death from illness to the point that a quote from my diary, "Not enough well ones to make a show," regarding drilling. The deaths were complicated by accidents, untrained troops, active weapons. Many accidents occurred. So death was a constant companion to me. I was responsible for assigning men to burial squads, and it was almost a daily occurrence in my military career. I received a promotion, a commission actually. I entered as a corporal. I was promoted to second lieutenant, and I received another promotion to first lieutenant. That is the rank I held when I was mustered out. I returned to Richmond, married during the war, mainly through correspondence. My wife and her family assisted me in purchasing a farm. I returned to Richmond fathered 4 children. I did not live to see the birth of my 4th child. He became a Richmond police officer. I've rested here since 1876. I thank you for your attention, and I want to step out of character for just a minute. Thank the Richmond Area Historic Society for giving me the opportunity to present to you a man I consider an American hero. I thank the Marshall family for allowing us to display a musket that was used in the Civil War. A friend of mine is holding a document that shows the type of records that we kept during the Civil War, and I think my ability to keep those records is one of the reasons that I was granted the privilege of corporal on entry and assigned to do significant recruiting. Most especially, I'd like to thank a friend who was kind enough to play the theme from the Ken Burns special on the Civil War, Mrs. Debbie Ryan. Thank you all.
Main Street, Beebe's Corners, Michigan, February 14th, 1865. How do you do, Annie, this fine Valentine morning? Are you sighing for the close of this unholy war, that some of those who are now away from home and friends may return, that you may again have a heart near you that is now covered with a blue coat? Or have you never chosen him from the many who have gone? If you have made no choice, let me ask you to wait well in view of my qualifications. Soon you decide who shall be your Valentine for the coming year, or should you let your choice fall on me, perhaps you might choose to let your Valentine cloak rest on my shoulders through the term of our natural lives. Now, as I am a poor hand at describing a person with a person, I think I will let you decide my fate without a description of my not overly handsome cortege, which is not improved by soldiering, for the blue coat and regulation cap does not set at all to my taste. But if you make a choice of my not very content self, I will try when the war ends to change my habiliments for some more becoming, at least to my taste, and I presume to your satisfaction. When you answer this phase, tell me all about your sleigh riding this season. Who has been your gallant beau, and if he has been as attentive as he ought to be? So fair a partner as you must be judging from the little that I have seen of your fair self. If he has been the least non-gallant, tell him to look well after his fastest horse and take in a good start. Soon this gallant soldier boy's return for all such will be summarily dealt with when we get home to prate it, you ladies. Hoping to meet you at home at so far distant day and to have the pleasure of making your acquaintance. Personally, I will send you this short note to introduce myself and prepare the way for a long and pleasant acquaintance. Very truly yours, your most obedient and possible Valentine, Simon Heath, Huntsville, Alabama.
My dear Simon wrote me that letter on Valentine's Day when he was in the Army. I have to look up where he was because I don't have a good memory at his age. He was serving during the Civil War in Company H of the 4th Michigan Infantry. I'll tell you about how we came to share this wonderful life together, but first let me tell you a little bit about myself. I was born in 1845 in Beebe's Corners, which is now Richmond. My father was Alexander Beebe and my mother was Priscilla Comstock. My father and his 2 brothers, Erastus and Henry, were early settlers of the area that first became known as Beebe's Corners, where 2 Indian trails along Memphis Ridge and Armada Ridge met. To get here, my uncles walked to Cleveland from New York and then took a ship to Detroit. They walked up the Gratiot Turnpike and eventually found their way here, coming through Armada. My father, Alexander, followed them later that year. The Beebe brothers received land grants from the government that were signed by President Van Buren. The brothers went about forming a settlement, selling lots and clearing land. They first built log houses and returned to New York to bring their families back to continue to settle the area. The map shows how Beebe's Corners looked in the 1850s. My father was an excellent carpenter and joiner, and he helped build many sturdy buildings and businesses. He built the Beebe House Hotel in 1847, just after I was born in 1845. There's a picture of it there, and here's a painting that was done by a local resident of the same hotel from that picture. I was the youngest of 4 girls, so my older sisters were kept busy around the hotel. Their names were Eliza, Martha, and Mary. School was first held for the children around the area at the Daniel Hall log cabin that sat just over there where the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is. You probably saw it coming in. Mrs. Hall hung up some quilts to form a small classroom. The first teacher was Mahela Weeks. When I became old enough to attend school, I went to a new school called the West School that was on the northwest corner of Armada Ridge and Low Plank Road. I loved to read, probably because my mother always read to me at night. My uncles had several businesses in the village. Erastus farmed and sold real estate, and Henry was a merchant. There's a picture of one of the first stores in the corners owned by my uncle, Henry P. Beebe. And as the village became more settled, we had many fine stores. These stores were built by Dr. Gleason in 1869 and stood on the east side of Main Street across from Armada Ridge ends. That picture is from a big snowstorm that was in April 6th of 1886. Do you remember it, Dave?
Yes, I do. I have trouble. Boy, no respect.
I came to Beebe's Corners at the age of 21 in 1861. I was born on August 1st, 1840 in Carlton of Orleans County, New York. Later, my family made their way to Hillsdale, Michigan, where I worked on my family's farm. When I arrived at Beebe's Corners, I worked as a clerk in the Pioneer Store, a general store and post office. My half-brother had worked there but had enlisted in the Army in 1861 to serve in the Civil War, leaving his position vacant. I rented a small room from which I made my way while I worked at the store, and I had the privilege to meet many of the fine folks of the village. This young lady caught my eye, as she would occasionally come to the store for provisions. She also fancied hard candy. She didn't know it, but I always put a couple extra pieces in her bag. Eager to serve, I enlisted in Company H, 4th Michigan Infantry, as sergeant on September 14, 1864. At the age of 24, I mustered in at Adrian on September 21st, 1864. My command took me to Nashville, Tennessee, and later to Decatur, Alabama. I served mostly on picket duty. The rigors and hardship of war caused me ill health, and I was honorably discharged for disability at Louisville, Kentucky on July 20th, 1865. It took me a year to recuperate enough to return to my former clerking position in 1866. Thankfully, my dear Annis received my Valentine letter from 1865, and we made acquaintance upon my return. She helped me recuperate as I had difficulty with my digestion. Our love grew, and as I became stronger, I asked her for her hand in marriage.
By the time Simon returned from the war, my father had managed to move the Beebe House Hotel across the street. I was amazed at how his men jacked up the hotel and with powerful teams of horses was able to move the hotel to its new location to be closer to the other businesses. Now can you imagine looking at that picture? Our wedding in 1867 was very nice. My parents received guests at the hotel and everyone was dressed in their finest. My sisters fussed over me and helped me with my dress. I was so happy. See how happy I was? My father, Alexander Beebe, began to build a new home for our family that still exists to this day on North Main Street. He built it with 2 beautiful stained glass windows, fine woodwork, and bay windows that faced the south to soak up the warm sunshine in the winter. He would sit in his rocker and watch the goings-on in the village from those windows. There's a picture of the house right down below there. Sadly, my mother passed away in the year of our marriage at the young age of 57. Simon and I resided there with my father until his death in 1878 at the age of 72. Simon and I had 3 lovely children that we loved dearly. J. Alexander, Charles Henry, and Maud, who died early at the age of 18. We have pictures of Charles and J. Alexander, original photos. We don't have one of Maud, unfortunately.
I continued to clerk at the store and help with the post office duties when I could. In 1876, I began a book and newspaper stand business for myself. Then, after 7 pretty good years, I was appointed Justice of the Peace. A challenging job at times, but weddings were a pleasure, having married a good number of the folks buried here. In 1876, I began a book, whoops, I already just said that. In July 1889, I was appointed postmaster by President Harrison and reappointed by Presidents McKinley and Roosevelt every 4 years. The cost to mail a letter was 2 cents per ounce to all parts of the United States. The post office, the newspaper, and the grapevine were the sources for your ancestors' families and public news. I continued to act in fair and reasonable fashion with the citizens of the village. I entered into the conveyancing and insurance business. I continued as Justice of the Peace for 22 years. I also served as Township Treasurer for 7 years and Township Clerk for 2 terms. I pride myself on making decisions that are strictly fair and impartial, being based upon the evidence, the law in the case, and the equity involved. I have acted as executor in settlements of many estates. Frequently, my appointments were unknown until the will was read. I've been a member of the Grand Army of the Republic and for 40 years a Mason, exemplifying the spirit of the craft. Upon my waning years, I am proud that my son Charles H. entered the Postal Service on the rural free delivery route and later became postmaster. And I am pleased to know that his son, my grandson Charles A. Heath, would become postmaster for a time as well.
My father died, as I said, in 1878, and he left me all the property, including the 25-acre homestead. Life was not easy for our family because Simon would continue his struggle with dysentery and weakness in his left arm from his military service. He did apply for a disability pension from the government, which required many annual doctor's visits and applications to the Veterans Administration, but he persevered and was a highly respected, trusted, influential citizen of our community. A fairly tall man at 5'10", Simon's weight was very slight. At the age of 41, he weighed 155 pounds. At the age of 51, he only weighed 135, results of his digestion malady. He was a noble man and provided for his family without complaint. Our son, Charles H. and Cora Weeks, were married May 10th, 1899, and that would be this picture. They had 3 children, Charles, Milton, and Marjorie, and they lived on Main Street across from the fire hall. One of my favorite stories involves our property over on the river in St. Clair. Simon had acquired it for a place for the family to go and enjoy the fresh air and the beauty of the river. We loved it there, and after he passed, I'd go there to stay for several weeks in the summer, and the grandchildren were often coming to visit. We had fun watching the ships go by and splashing in that cold water together. There was a rail spur from the station at Ridgeway, now called Lennox, that headed to St. Clair. Cora would put little Charles on the train starting from age 3. The conductor would help him get off in St. Clair, where I, his grandma Annie, would meet him at the top of the hill across from the cottage. Once when he was 5, he got off the train, and I wasn't there. He got a little irate, came down the hill to the cottage, and he says, "Grandma, how come you weren't there to meet me?" She said, "Well, you're 5 now." So, I'm pleased to know that my great-great-great-grandchildren are now enjoying the cottage at the river. My dear Simon passed from the earth on November 4th, 1911 at the age of 60, leaving the children and myself our 25-acre farm and business to take care of. The boys took good care of me, and I continued to live in the house. I have the original will I left. If anybody's interested, if you're too cold, it's up to you. But I think it's kind of neat that they saved this will so I could read it to you. I refer to myself as Annie because that's what everybody called me. I, Annie O. Heath of Richmond, Michigan, being of full age and sound mind, do make and declare this to be my last will and testament, which is as follows. First, I appoint Dr. C.E. Green to be the executor of this, my last will and testament. Second, I direct that a suitable monument be erected in the cemetery, Richmond Cemetery, for myself and my late husband, Simon H. Heath, which is behind us, right? Third, I give and bequeath to my grandchildren, Sadie Beth Heath Lowitz, Forrest Heath, Marjorie L. Heath, Milton Heath, and Charles A. Heath, the sum of $100 each. Now this was at the end of the Big Depression, so that was pretty good. Fourth, after the full payment of all my just debts and funeral expenses, the balance of my estate, both real and personal, I give and bequeath to my son, Charles H. Heath. In witness thereof, I have hereunto subscribed my name this 23rd day of October, AD 1933, and I passed the following month. And the reason J. Alexander did not get, he had passed away in 1915.
Well, hello, I'm Rena Fanning Linke, and this is my husband, Albert F. Linke. And we haven't been dead very long, so some of you gray hairs, when you were kids, might remember us. My Albert was president of the Richmond Bank on Main Street. And you might know that building. It's the one with the pillars. Well, PNC bought it and put their name on it, but still it was Albert who was responsible for the bank's success. See, my Albert is a hometown boy. He was born in Lenox Township, graduated from Richmond High School, and went to Detroit Business College. And when he was 20 in 1906, Mr. Acker, who was the president of Richmond Bank, lured him to come back to Richmond to be the cashier and help out Mr. Acker. Now you see, Mr. Acker was a wonderful man. He had started the bank in 1886 and did very well. It was considered one of the oldest and most private banks, but he ran into trouble because you see, he had an elevator company. Now yes, we had elevators in the 1900s. He had an elevator company and he had some other man run it. And the man ran it into the ground. And the bad thing was, the bank had lent a lot of money to this elevator company. So, conflict of interest? I think so. But Mr. Acker was a honest man. He immediately closed the bank, reorganized it, brought in Albert. In 1915, it became the first national bank of Richmond. In 1919, Albert, through his good management, paid off all of the creditors. And 10 years later, in 1925, we had a big banquet at the First Methodist Church to celebrate our 10 years because our deposits went from $25,000 to $50,000. So that was steady years of good growth. I want to show you a picture of Albert and I when we were courting because I had such a skinny waist. I want people to know that. You probably have seen the picture, but you can pass it around. That's us at the end of the line. There's two of us. So,
that's enough, Brenna. Brenna and I got married. She's a local girl, incidentally. We got married on January 1st, 1913. We took our honeymoon to Jacksonville, Florida. Took the train down. Those people in Florida don't move around much. They're slow and behind, and the animals look like leftover.
Leftover. What about the horses?
The horses were poor. They evidently don't feed them much, and they're very lame, and the cattle are the same way. And it's nothing to see pigs on the street there by the depot and around the stores and such.
Well, yes, that was quite a trip. You see, I insisted that we go out of town for our honeymoon because Albert was such a, I think you call them today, workaholics. He wanted to go back to work January 2nd, and he felt pretty odd not being at the office when we were on the train going south. But anyway, we had a very good life. We had 3 children, and 2 of them are buried here. Bud, our son's there, and our daughter Margaret is there. They didn't stay in Richmond, you know. These kids went off. Margaret went off to the East Coast. Mary went off to the East Coast, and Margaret went to Birmingham, and then our son lived in London, England. And I have a picture of them when I turned 90. By that time, my Albert had already passed on, but this is a picture of me when I turned 90 with the 3 of them. St. Clair Inn. Still have somewhat of a small waist. And this is a clock that was my father's that we donated to the bank, but then I guess the city took it over. They didn't want the bank to have that clock. We had a home in town and a cottage on Fairhaven in Anchor Bay. And we were fortunate to build a house later on Ridge Street. And it was such a big deal in Richmond, they made a story about it. And they went in great description about everything about the thing. And you know what? Albert? I'm wondering if the present owners are keeping it up. Maybe our ghost should go back for a visit. You know, it's almost Halloween. Wouldn't that be a stitch? Well, as I say, I lost my Albert when he was 85, and I died 5 years later. I was 96. I almost made it to 100. But anyway, I want you to know that when you look at that bank, which is now PNC, just know it was my Albert that kept it going all these years, through the wars, through the Depression. And I even heard a story that he was always the first one in the bank, and he would grab the newspaper before anybody else got it, go into his office, shut the door, and he would come out about 11 o'clock. And I think he spent the whole 3 hours doing the crossword puzzle. But nobody knew, because then he would go across the street to the barber shop, take the paper, and whip through the crossword puzzle, and everybody was so impressed. But he really cheated, so. But anyway, that's our story, and thank you for coming to see us. And, you know, as I say, when you pass by that bank, it was Albert that kept it going.
Well, look at here. I'm so glad to have company. Everybody's here? Well, welcome to the Fullers. I am Mabel Fuller. I was, let's see, in 1898, I was born in Bad Axe, Michigan. And I went to school there. I was a good student. And I graduated from Bad Axe High School. And then, unfortunately, you know, my mother passed away. And, well, then I had to go live with my brother and his family. And guess where that was? It was in Richmond, Michigan. And that was a nice spot. Well, do you know, he had a bakery, and he made something like 100 loaves of bread a day, and cookies and pies and cakes and all kinds of things like that. And so I helped him out there. Well, then in 1917, you know what happened? World War I came along, and my brother joined the army and went off to France. And so I stayed at the bakery and helped out there, waited on people and took care of the books and things like that. And you know, I got a lot of business experience at that time that later on in life I really took advantage of that. Well, okay, and then in 1919 the boys came back, my brother came back, and that handsome Hugh Fuller came back, and we got together, and we finally got married, and he was a wonderful man. He served in France too, you know, in the war. Well, he was from the Columbus Township, if you know where that is. It's out that way. And he came from the Fuller family. His father was Palmer. No, his father was Clayton. His grandfather was Palmer. And Palmer was the first of the 5 Palmer boys that had houses on Main Street, Richmond, right out there. And then he had a brother, Hosea, and he married Jane Weeks. And Jane Weeks was the sister of Ira Weeks, you know, the one that started all that meat business. Well, anyway, Hugh and I did get married, and we had a wonderful life. We had 2 children, Gerald and Elizabeth. And when World War II came along, Gerald joined the 9th Army Air Corps Signal Corps. And Elizabeth joined the Waves. Can you imagine that? We were so proud. We were so proud of them. We had 6 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild. But now back to Hugh and I. We did have a wonderful life in small town America, Richmond. You know, it was great. And you know, what did we do? Now think about that. Well, how did he make his living? Well, you know, that was a time in the teens and in the 20s. People, ordinary people, were having cars. You know, good old Model Ts and things like that. So by golly, Hugh opened up a gas station and a shop where people could get their car fixed and that sort of thing. Cars were a lot simpler then. So we did very well with the gas station. And then I don't know if some of you might remember Willard Trudgeon. They called him Doc Trudgeon. He was a chemistry teacher at the high school. But in the summer, of course, he was off from work, right? So in the summer, he would come and help Hugh out, and then we could take a vacation. And it worked out really well, really well. So I have to say one more thing. Hugh was the very first school bus driver in Richmond. by golly, probably around the late 30s and into the 40s. So, you know, things don't always go the way you think they're going to go, right? Sometimes sad things happen, and that's what happened to us. Hugh was walking across Main Street one day, and as I said, his shop, his gas station was on the middle of the block between where Chaps is and where Ken's is now, right in the middle of the block. But he was crossing Main Street, and a car hit him, and it was very bad, and he was very badly hurt, and you know, he never did recover, really. And we tried to take care of him, but we finally had to put him in to the rest home, Evangelical rest home on Outer Drive in Detroit. And you know, he was only 52 years old when that happened. And he was at that rest home for 19 years, if you can imagine. Died at 71. So that was a sad time. Well, you know, we went along. 47, that happened in 47, 48, 49, and you know, it got a little tight financially after that, and what to do. And then, of course, we had sold the gas station, and we had money from that, so I got an idea. You know, that was a time when women were collecting china teacups and things like that, and they had things like embroidered hankies. You do remember hankies, don't you? Do you remember hankies? Well, I had this idea. I would open up a gift shop right in my own house, right in the living room and dining room, and call it the Fuller Gift Shop. And that's exactly what I did. And it worked out just wonderfully. Everybody loved it. And if you look at the table here, I can tell you about some of the things that we had. I tried to have very, very good quality items, but a variety. Of course, the china teacups and the figurines, and then we have like embroidered hand towels and lace and napkins and lace for the table. And then for the children, we had things like Nancy Drew books. Some of you might remember Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys and the Bobbsey Twins. And there were other toys, but one of the things that the girls just loved were the Madame Alexander dolls. And you can see those after a while. You can come up and look closer if you want to. And of course we had penny candy. And another thing, I had a collection of children's clothes, small infant clothes. And people would come to the store and buy shower gifts, you know, for baby showers and things like that. And as a matter of fact, I have something to show you. They also bought wedding gifts, because right here, this was 65 years ago. This was given to Janet Klauke for her wedding by one of her mother's very best friends. So this was one of the items from my gift shop. Isn't that the sweetest thing? I just love that. Well, I was a very busy lady. I joined, I was a member of the First Congregational Church, and I was a member of the Eastern Star, and I was also a member of the Sullivan Burke American Legion Auxiliary. Now remember that name Burke, because Scott Burke, who was a member of our community, was the sheriff of Macomb County for many years in the 30s and 40s, and he was a great guy. So you got to remember Scott Burke. Well, let's see, what else did I do? I helped organize fashion shows, children's fashion shows, for the Daughters of Isabella of the St. Augustine Church, and also the Eta Zeta Pi Ladies Club. They put on some fashion shows too. And I was a member of the Women's Study Club. So I was a busy lady, and times were good. But, you know, in 1966, I fell and broke my hip. Well, it happens, you know. And so when I went to the hospital, and of course, small town, my neighbors and friends came in and helped at the store while I was gone, just like they always do, those good neighbors in small towns. And then I finally got back, and the doctor said, you know, maybe you better think about closing up and calling it a day. I had run the store for 16 years, and it was great. It went very nicely. But I then had to move up with my son and his family in Elkton, Michigan. That's up in the Thumb area. And I was there for about 12 years, and then the good Lord decided it was time for me to go on. So that's what happened. But I want to, while I was up there, lately I've been getting these thoughts or memories or something floating up by people that you might know. I want to read them to you. By the way, I said floated up, right? It floated up to me, not down, okay? You know that, okay. Now, this is Barbara Bryan. I love Nancy Drew and Kitty Shaner. In 1962, I got married, and some shower gifts I got came from there. And then when I had my firstborn in 1965, I got baby gifts from there, from my little store. Mark Furstenau. My mother used to shop there for gifts, and if I was good, I might get to pick something for myself. Marcia Fletcher Wisniewski. Spent many days looking at her store as a young girl, and I also got cookies. Yeah, I used to make cookies sometimes and pass them around. Christmas shopping was the best. I did layaway. Tommy Trend. Used to spend my Christmas club money there every year. Mostly pot holders. Nice memories. Pam Townsend Green. I remember getting our Madame Alexander dolls there. And Brenda Townsend Schweiger. Loved to go to her shop. I remember the dolls and the dresses. Ruth Coppinger Sulwakowski. Loved going into that little shop with my mom. Beverly Russ Lockwood. I remember it well. I lived on Madison Street, and I would walk there, and I bought all my Bobbsey twin books there with my allowance and babysitting money. They were a sweet couple. Wasn't that nice? She said we were a sweet couple. Doris Martin. I remember buying hand-painted teacups that she personalized as wedding gifts. And then Beverly Russ Lockwood. I remember shopping there for Mother's Day presents. One of my mom's favorites was a ceramic lady in a fancy dress with 2 white poodles attached to her hand with little chains. I recently saw a similar one in a rental cottage on Harson's Island. Maybe it was the same one. Just one more page here. Get it to the right page. Oh, it's cold. Al Bryant. Oh, I remember her and her husband Hugh. They're really nice people. It's nice. And Jean Neiman. I remember going there and having a hard time deciding what to buy. Oh, I love that store. And Timmy Ricks. Went there with my mom often, and she loved the China figurines. And I loved the penny candy. Pam Shepard Smith. That is where I got my Madame Alexander dolls. I also bought a teacup and saucer every year for my mom for Mother's Day. I love that store. Kathy Miller. Madame Alexander dolls is what I remember about that shop. Oh, wish we still had shops like that. You know what? This makes me feel so good inside. Well, that's it.
Well, hello. I'm so glad that you came today. You know, I have had just the most wonderful week. You see, I celebrated my 90th birthday. And what a wonderful 90 years. years I have had. Now I know you probably already know this, but it was my great-grandfather, Daniel Hall, who had 300 acres here. And he built that log cabin, and he put up that quilt in the log cabin to partition it off for the first school. And my great-grandmother said, we have to have a school in this area. So those 6 children came to their log home for school. And that began the Hall, the Hall living in the family living in this area. Now, my mother's side, that is my mother's side, and my father's side also goes back to the first pioneer settlers, because they came here from the eastern part of the United States, and it was John William Lieut who brought his family to New Haven in about 1854. And they settled in the New Haven area, and it was there that he started a stagecoach, and he was in the horse business. And it was during that time they brought 4 sons and a daughter, and they lost 3 of their sons and 1 daughter due to the scarlet fever the same year in 1954. So they went back out east, and they had another baby, and they came back to New Haven, and then he came into the Lenox area. And John William Lieut was living in the Lenox area, and he had all of that experience with the stagecoach and having a hotel in New Haven, so he went and worked in the BB Hotel for a little while. And his son, John Burton, met a girl there. And that girl was Sarah Cyril's, and she was the stepdaughter of Alexander Beebe. So my family on both sides goes back to the first pioneers in this area. So we've been around here quite a long time. Now my mother, Sarah Hall Mills Lutz, was living with my father for a while, and she was the most wonderful woman. I just loved her so dearly, and she even liked my grandfather, John Williams the Senior. Now, we have a lot of Sarahs in my family. I think you should know that. I was the 7th Sarah. Both of my great-grandmothers were Sarah. I had an Aunt Sarah. I had a sister Sarah. I mean, we just have lots and lots of Sarahs. And this is a picture of Sarah, my great-grandmother, that was the stepdaughter of Alexander Beebe. Now, John Burton, my grandfather, was a great horse trader. He was known all over the area for getting horses, and he supplied most of the horses to the Detroit Railroad system. And it was from John Burton that my father, Charles Burton, learned about the horse business. And so my father, Charles Burton, first was in the horse business. And on my birth certificate, when I was born in 1908, it had his profession as horse trader. He was many things in Richmond after a horse trader. He sold cars, he sold real estate, and he became the president of the National Bank of Richmond. So he had a lot of titles here in Richmond. And he had a sister, Mabel Lutz, and Mabel married a man, and they started a jewelry store in Richmond. And that jewelry store was located right next to the Lovejoy store in downtown Richmond. And then his brother, John, a graduate of the University of Michigan, was a pharmacist, and he had 2 drugstores in town. So I was thinking about that, and I thought, you know, if a young man went to my sister's jewelry store and bought a ring, and then he got a little bit nervous about that, he could go see my Uncle John, get a little something to take care of that nervousness at the drugstore, and if that didn't work, he could go see my dad, buy a car, and head straight out of town. At some point, my Uncle John sold the 2 drugstores, and he went into the automobile dealership with my father. And it was called the Lutz Brothers Dealership. And that was located where the National Bank is currently located in Richmond. Now, when I was growing up, I lived at the corner of Jefferson and Main. And oh my goodness, it was just wonderful living in town. And we had a funeral in our home, we had receptions in our home, and we had birthdays in our home. And I remember the most wonderful birthday I had when I turned 13 years old. I invited 35 of my closest friends to my birthday party. I'm thinking maybe now that 35 girls were probably all the girls in town at that time that came to my birthday party. And my parents had laid out at my birthday party my christening gown that they had when I was born in 1908. And for my birthday, I got this wonderful brownie candle. And let me tell you, we had a lot of fun with that growing up. Another memory I have growing up in Richmond is we had a little cottage in Orchard Beach in St. Clair. This is a picture of my father, Charles, in St. Clair on the river. And I would sit there with my mother and my grandmother, and they would tell me stories about growing up in Richmond. And my father would be out on the river in his little boat, and he'd have the fishing pole out there, and we'd look out there, and he'd raise his hand high into the air with this great big wave to us up at the cottage, and we would wave back. And that night we had the best fish dinner that you could ever imagine. Now as time went on, at 1925, and I lost my grandfather in 1925, and he died right there in our cottage on the St. Clair River. And I thought to myself, what a wonderful way to end your life, with that soft breeze coming in from the river and the quietness and hearing the birds around. So in 1926, the year after I lost my grandfather, I graduated from Richmond High School. I was in a class of 30. Now, my grandmother also graduated from Richmond High School in a class of 3. So my class was 10 times bigger than hers. My father graduated from Richmond High School in a class of 7. Now, my older sister also graduated from Richmond High School, and she went on and went to the University of Michigan, got a degree in pharmacy. I went to the University of Michigan after graduating, and my brother Phil also went to the University of Michigan. And my brother Phil had a dealership in town, and that was located right there across from the town clock. And when I was looking through all my old newspapers and pictures, I saw an ad for his dealership, and it said, "I trade for anything. Cars, trucks, cattle, horses, machinery, located across from the town clock." So that was the only address he gave in his advertisements, said he was across from the town clock. We all know what's across from the town clock now. That would be the Foster station. So that's where my brother Phil was. Now, when I was away at U of M for those 4 years, I graduated, and then I worked for University of Michigan after I graduated in the study for women, and I was the head of their social department, so I would plan parties for the girls and little dances and that sort of thing, and I just had a wonderful, wonderful time doing that. And then I was offered a job at the University of Arizona. So I moved to Arizona, and in 1939, which was one of the trips my parents came to see me, I saw a little ad in the newspaper when I was digging through all my memorabilia at my birthday party, and I saw in there where they put a little ad in the paper, and it said, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Lutz visited their daughter Sarah in Arizona. They traveled by plane, and it only took 10 hours. So after the University of Arizona, that visit when they were there in 1939, my father passed away, and that was actually the last time I got to see him. Oh, when I think about that, it still makes me a little bit sad, because we were really very, very close. And the next year, I was offered a position, Dean of Women, at the University of Idaho. So I took that position, and I met the most wonderful man, Harry Healy. And we came back to Richmond, and in 1940, I married Healy. We had a beautiful ceremony at the St. Clair Inn, and my brother walked me down the aisle, and my grandmother was there, and my mother, and my sister was my matron of honor. Then we went off and traveled, and we settled into Georgia, because my husband was the financial director for the University of Georgia. So we settled into Georgia, and we had a very nice life going on, and 9 years later, here he passed away. It was very, very sad. We had a service there at the university for him, and then we brought him home, and he's buried here. And I took a job at the University of Michigan again as Dean of Women, because I wanted to be close to my family and close to home. It was very comforting for me at that time. So I took this job at the University of Michigan, and then in 1954, the University of Alabama got in contact with me, and they wanted me to come to their university to be the Dean of Women there. And I knew what had happened in 1952 at that university. It seems that year there were 2 young black women who were admitted to the university, and on the day that they were to enroll in classes, they were told that they were no longer allowed at the university because they were black. So they were not allowed to take classes, even though they had been already admitted. So needless to say, there were a few little lawsuits that followed. And then in 1955, this would be the year that I arrived on campus actually, the laws, they passed a law in the courts that said you could not discriminate against race, that it was a public school and that everyone was welcome in public schools. So this young woman by the name of Miss Lucy, then in 1956, showed up on campus to start her first classes. And probably 2,000 or 3,000 people came to campus that day. And there were fires in the streets, there were rocks being thrown, and eggs being thrown, and name calling. It was absolutely a frightening experience. And I knew where she was for class that day, so I got in my car and I drove over to the lecture hall where she was, and I said, Lucy, we need to get out of here. I put her in the back seat of my car, I laid her down, and I started driving out of campus. Again, rocks were being thrown at us. The Ku Klux Klan was on every corner of the campus and into town. By the time I got off of campus, the windows were shattered in my car, but I got her to safety. That was 1956. On Monday, she was to report to class, and the university had gone to the courts, and they said, we don't think she should come to this university. It is not safe for her, nor is it safe for the people that attend here. And the courts upheld that determination by the University of Alabama, so she was expelled. I continued to work for the university. I worked hard for women's programs and worked hard to desegregate because I knew that education was for everyone. 7 years later, June 11th, 1963, George Wallace came to our university. Now we knew he was coming because we had 2 black students, the first since 1956, that had applied to the university and were accepted, and that was the day they were to enroll. So Dean Blackburn and I and 30 students went all around campus. We took out all the pop machines, we picked up all the stones, we picked up all the rocks, all the limbs. We couldn't find as much as a toothpick on campus. And we went over to Foster Auditorium. And sure enough, good to his word, George Wallace came, he climbed those steps, he stood in front of the doors of Foster Auditorium, and he proclaimed that stand at the schoolhouse door. And that was a term he had used in his inaugural speech, and true to his word, he stood there for 4 hours. And as those 2 black students, James Hood and Vivian Malone, climbed those steps to register for classes, he would not budge. There were many people there that day. There weren't any fires. There were no rocks thrown. The students were not allowed to go in. President Kennedy called the National Guard and he said, you will remove him from those steps. If you have to do physically, do it physically. So the National Guard went to Governor Wallace and they said, you need to leave. And Governor Wallace did step down. So Dean Blackburn and I took Vivian Malone and James Hood We walked them up the steps to Foster University, and that was the beginning of desegregation at the University of Alabama, and that was also the beginning of the last state in the Union to desegregate their public schools. That was in 1963. I continued to work for the university until 1971 when I retired. It was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful experience. I loved it there. In 1971 when I retired, they gave me an honorary doctorate degree. Very proud moment in my life. They also now have 2 scholarships in my name, Sarah Healy scholarships that are given out annually to students at the university. In 1988, Miss Lucy, all in 1956, tried to go to school there. In 1988, the University of Alabama annulled her expulsion. They allowed her back into school where she came and she finished her master's degree, and she and her daughter both graduated at the same time in the same commencement service. So that was, of course, a very, very, very proud moment. Now, I want to back up just for a minute because I've talked how so many of us went to college and how important education was to our family. This is a picture of Mrs. Charles Lutz. That would be my mother, and she was breaking ground in 1959 at what is now the Richmond High School on 32 Mile Road. And that was the Lutz farm. And they started school there then in 1960. So it was the Lutz farm that became the site of the Richmond High School. A very, very proud moment for our family indeed. You know, I got to thinking at the end of my birthday party about all the things that happened in my 90 years. And you know, I have a hard time remembering all of it because the older you get, you know, sometimes things kind of go together and they get a little foggy. So I wrote them down and I'd like to share them with you now. During my 90 years, I have seen horses to cars, telephones, computers, cell phones, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Bay of Pigs, the Gulf War, and of course other situations that the United States was in. I saw the Panama Canal open. I lived through the flu epidemic from 1918 to 1920, which killed 20 million people. There was the 18th Amendment, Prohibition, and the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. And I want to tell you, that was 1 year before my 13th birthday, and that was all the talk around town. Well, how are the women going to know how to vote? Who's going to tell them who to vote for? Oh my goodness. Don't you know, we girls, we had a little laugh about that. I saw the first transatlantic flights from Lindbergh and Earhart, the stock market crash, the Great Depression, the Star-Spangled Banner named our national anthem, the drop of the atomic bomb, the Civil Rights Act, a man on the moon, a president assassinated, a civil rights leader assassinated. I have seen 16 presidents during my 90 years. It has been a full 90 years, from horse buggy to man on the moon. And I have to tell you, my years in Richmond and my years at the University of Alabama are truly represent the person and the woman that I've become. So, you know, I guess